Hello and welcome to the OnFraud podcast. We are going to be talking about some of the latest fraud news, hopefully with some insights. We'll look at a few trends and things like that. Without further ado, we should probably introduce ourselves.
Hi, my name is Dimi, and I'm one of the senior document specialists here at Onfido, and I look after trends and patterns in fraud.
I'm Simon, and again, another senior document specialist at Onfido, a senior fraud specialist. I come from a background of working in government for something like 10 years, and then in the private industry as a forgery expert as well for a further 7 years or so. Without further ado, let's talk about today's topics. So, Demi, what are we going to talk about today?
Today, we're going to have a look at some of the regulation that's coming in the space of identity and fraud that is aligning businesses into the digital age. And it's estimated that within the next 5 years, 60% of all of the globe's economy will be digital. So on that note, it's important for everyone that transacts with customers or businesses to make sure that they're complying to their regulations as to how they're dealing with those individuals and entities. We're going to split these kinds of different types of regulations and frameworks and how they're being applied across some of geographies, some industries, and look at how it's affecting different technologies as well. What do you think, Simon? Anything else to add to that?
I think the main aim maybe of today's podcast is to dip our toe into these waters, maybe try and clarify things a little bit and avoid some of the confusion that surrounds these, because there's a lot of regulation that's emerging, and where there is so much weighty information that's being produced, sometimes it can be quite easy to get lost in the weeds. So maybe we can try and clean that up a bit as we go.
Right. So one of the things that keeps getting mentioned and is one of the hot topics today is financial inclusion or digital inclusion, and in many senses, it's almost become a measure of like the speed at which an economy can grow,
Yeah.
or a sector can grow, as well as kind of an index for essentially welfare. In that respect, like we have different levels of openness for this financial inclusion between all the continents. Well, what's your experience with that, Simon?
Yeah, certainly. It's an interesting time. We've traditionally been much more physically based. If you wanted to open up some kind of financial account, you would have to be physically present. But we're moving into an era now where it's more commonplace, or it's certainly becoming more commonplace to access and create these services digitally, which requires less and less face-to-face interaction.
Yeah, and with the migration of all of these services interactions into an online environment, different countries have adopted a bit of a like different strategies when it comes to this, and it's all dependent on kind of like the population that you have, obviously, the internet penetration and the infrastructure that you
Mhm.
have. Any other things that countries take into account when they're thinking about this kind of stuff? What do you think, Simon?
Um, yeah, it's important that you don't leave people behind. It's very easy as people move forward. If you're in the haves, then you have all these things at your fingertips. You, you don't have to think too hard about it. You're going to get the latest phone, or you're going to get the latest iPad, or what have you. You're going to have the best Wi-Fi. You can already pay for this stuff. But as technology is moving forward and we're moving more into this kind of environment, it's important that it's accessible to all, and that it is accessible with the lowest tier of equipment, as it were. So just having, I mean, smartphones have become far more prevalent now. We could talk about the fact that there's a much better market penetration. The fact that the majority or an increasing number of the world now has access to a smartphone, and with that, faster speeds as well, means that these kind of things are a lot more open to a much wider base of people, and it's not just the people at the top end of the tree.
Yeah, and historically, different regions have had different approaches to getting these people financially included and transacting across different platforms. We know
Mm.
that in North America and Western Europe, we've had the credit reference agencies or credit bureaus that have kept ledgers against people's, let's say, reliability to return a loan,
Yeah.
and that became a de facto kind of like way to identify your customers.
Hmm.
We have other examples across, for example, India and China that have gone with a nationalized model where all of the individuals' credentials or their PII and information is backed up against government data and is then accessible to the user to share their credentials with the relevant institutions that they're transacting with. But
Yeah, I mean that. I mean, sorry if we just sidetrack. I mean that in itself is a little bit interesting, insofar as when we look at a lot of the regulations that are being created and the legislation that surrounds those, certainly within the EU, for example, or across the United States, and we're seeing all of these regulations that are now being created to try and cope with the emergence of and the importance of your biometric data, for example, or your digital presence online. It's interesting that you've got this model where governments have already gone ahead, created databases that have all of your information in. They're accessible to several people at the same time, and it does kind of beg the question of, you know, how are these going to fit with the regulations that are being brought in other parts of the world? You're not going to be compliant if you're not following the same kind of regulations, or at least you don't have the same core beliefs at the heart of it.
And certainly, interoperability becomes a big issue, especially when you think about people traveling and then changing their residence from their original place of
Mm.
birth. So then, if you would have to like cross-reference someone which is from one place where the government has decided that they will verify credentials, digitally issued credentials in a certain way, when that information might be requested from a separate government or a separate entity not in the home country,
Yeah,
that you might run into interoperability roadblocks, which is definitely something you don't want to look at.
yeah,
On the other hand, you do have the challenges of having the verification being owned partly or completely by a private actor. We know with all of the data hacks that have been on the media lately.
well,
So
I mean,
yeah.
the hacker doesn't mind if you're a government agency or a private firm. It's all fair game. It's just a puzzle to be unlocked. Yeah, but it's a very real danger if you're going to just have things siloed into these databases and then just keep them online.
Yeah, and in that note, we have different the all of these different approaches that let people go online and transact. Some people use government entries into database. Some people use the uh, biometrics or other like
Hmm.
authentication credentials that they've stored again for the users. We all know we can log into our iPhones and all the other devices with our fingerprints and so on.
Mm.
And in if you think about it, in essence, what is this pushing towards? Where are we going in this more digitized world? If we have to think about the fraud element of it, it means
Mm.
that essentially you're giving access to as many people as you can. So you're widening the net for your, let's say, good customers, but that
Yep.
invariably means that you're opening up the net for your bad customers.
Bad customers as well. Yeah, you're bad actors.
So what are the strategies the regulations have come ahead with and proposed for institutions to deal with these types of risks? Well,
Mm.
we've seen a few of them across Europe, and I think there's an interesting contrast between in transparency between Western Europe and the US, where we have frameworks such as the GDPR
Yep.
that protect user data, but at the same time, limitations such as the Payment Service Directive, the PSD2 legislation, which, like broadly speaking, limits or like pushes the liability of transactions onto payment service providers, and those payment service
Yeah.
providers can then will then have to mitigate what level of assurance they're using when they're verifying their customers and their users to enable them to transact on that platform.
Well, I think some of this kind of to me, there's a very strong undertone to all of this. The legislation seems to be built after someone has created a service, and I think what we tend to see with a lot of this, when you actually look at it, is governments are actually being led by technology that's coming from private firms. So a firm develops technology, creates a service, they create a new landscape, and then you've got governments that are trying to play catch up, essentially. And then it becomes more of a case of regulations trying to deflect blame or protect certain vested parties from liability. In some cases, they're trying to protect the individual, but maybe they're defining that they're protecting the individual by pushing the responsibility to another party instead.
Yeah, and that's totally the case. We've seen this happen a number of times where a new sweeping regulatory change becomes just another tick boxing exercise. But it's interesting to look at the context of what's happening now in the world of fraud and money laundering, in the fallout of what have been some of the most interesting Panama Papers and the other papers on hidden funds and money laundering. And it's clear to see that this is one of the responses. They want to crack down on certain countries and certain
Yep.
vehicles for money laundering, and it makes sense because there's an estimated large proportion of the global trade that goes untaxed or as part of the black economy, fueling terrorism or all of those nasty activities.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's obvious that you want to do that, but it's to what extent you're leaving people unprotected. At the same time, you're trying to weed out the bad actors. You're trying to stop these particular activities happening, but are you excluding people who should really be entitled to these services? If it's not all inclusive, I mean, if say for instance, geography becomes one of the biases towards it, then how are we actually moving forward, and how are we making something better for humanity? As a species, how are we getting things improved?
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting that you mentioned this. Actually, there are currently an estimated 25 or so million refugees
Mm.
worldwide, and not an insignificant part of them is across currently trying to access different services across Europe. And we both, as a country and as a culture, have struggled to reconcile that. And these are people; they have human rights, they have refugee
Yep.
rights, and they should be able to pursue their own livelihoods. But at the same time, there are very few models or infrastructures which authenticate these people or prove that these people are who they say they are, and enable them to then pursue on their ambitions, which is
Yeah.
a
Well, I mean,
shame.
with the particular example of refugees, it presents any number of problems. I mean, we could probably have another podcast where we talk entirely on that issue. But yeah, one of the main problems you have is to access any of these services, you need to be verified. You need to have your identity verified. And if we're talking about people that are refugees, in many cases, it may be that they can't correctly identify, properly identify themselves. Maybe their documents have been destroyed. Maybe they've had to give them up. Maybe they don't want to become visible to the government that issued to them for obvious, reasons of persecution. So it's understandable that it becomes difficult to verify that individual's bona fides, but at the same time, that then also, whatever solution you come up with for someone who's genuinely in that position is going to be open to exploitation by people who have other interests or other objectives as well. It's a very tricky one to do, but at the same, you can't be marginalising these people that have already come from a very difficult situation. You can't marginalise them further by denying them the services and the facilities that many other people are gaining access to purely by virtue of the fact they can present a driving license or a passport.
Yeah, and I think that this is interesting in the context of what's happening, because we know that there is a forecast for climate change, and most of the data suggests that by the 2050 we're going to miss the 2-degree mark. And there are UN estimates that say that up to 500 million people will become climate refugees by
Mm.
2050. So this is going to be a good proportion of the world. How are we
Yeah.
now preparing for what might be unavoidable in this context? This might be laying the foundations of how we deal with interoperability and how we deal with disaster situations, essentially.
Yeah, this is true. And I think at the same time, just purely from an economics point of view, if you're any kind of government body, even if you're a financial service or some other kind of service provider, you're looking for the most frictionless and cost-effective way to bring people onto any services, whether they're government services, whether it's opening an account for something or accessing monies or transfers or something along those lines. And one of the easiest and most economic ways to do that is to be paperless. If I can verify you digitally, then obviously that means that there's less friction involved. It also means I don't need to physically produce a document for you, which just brings that cost down further. I mean, you and I have seen this happening already with certain countries where we know that they're starting to favour digital versions of identity documents over the physical version, which obviously from our perspective has got significant drawbacks, but you can certainly appreciate why it's an attractive model. And this is, I think, one of the things that we're touching upon here is that this needs to be cleaned up as soon as possible because it's clearly the way that everything is likely to go. But at the moment, there's no clear set definition of the best way moving forward to get this all put into place.
Yeah, and it's interesting that different countries have all of these different approaches. We obviously have the Estonian model, where
Hmm.
all of the government services are digitized, and all of the population has had a document issued that can serve as kind of a cryptographic key as well, which
Hmm.
is linked to their own personal information and codes. So you have that, which is one model. Then you have the Indo-Chinese model, where they have a centralized database which contains biometrics that they release on a case by case basis to other organizations. But then
Yeah.
you have a decentralized EU model, which has the EIDAS and EKYC schemes,
Yeah.
as well as the interoperability of passporting or banking license across most of Europe. So, with all of these in the context of the financial inclusion, I think that like you can definitely say that North America and the Western Europe have it pretty well with with some regions in the Asia Pacific leapfrogging as well, while with
Mm.
others being left a tiny bit behind. And here I'm thinking of the Southeast Asia region and parts of Latin America, which
Mm.
haven't had as good of a financial inclusion in the past few years, let's say.
Well, just to come back to something that you sort of touched upon there, the whole idea of this leapfrogging with economies. This is where sort of you can make massive bounds in technological advances from being quite behind to suddenly being on the cutting edge. So we were talking about this earlier, and the idea sort of that I think the essence of this idea tends to be of uh, certain elements of the African population where people have had no electricity at all, and then suddenly they're making the leap now to jump straight forward from that to solar powered energy, which is off the grid. So they've gone from nothing straight to green power straight away, which is quite a leap. And I think what you're seeing with certainly Africa, certain countries in Africa, and I would imagine you'll see this in Latin America as well, is this adoption of a digital model because it's a lot easier, where the infrastructure isn't quite as well established or doesn't work quite as well for the number in the population. A digital model is certainly far more preferential. And I think the easiest way to do this, given coming back to what we were saying earlier about the market penetration of mobile phone, the easiest way to do this, the way that seems the line of least resistance, is probably to piggyback on a SIM service. So you're relying on private companies to create an infrastructure that you can then jump into, and you can get someone to help you develop that for an amount of funding. as opposed to maybe starting something from scratch and having to build a whole infrastructure. You are kind of piggybacking or leapfrogging on many of the things that are already in existence to gain wider access to a much larger population.
Yeah, and on this concept of leapfrogging, there's definitely the context, or what's coming into my mind right now is bootstrapping a revolution.
Yeah.
You had the M wallet revolution across wide regions of Africa, where people
Hmm.
went from having no currency and no financial access at all to an M wallet, which was linked to a mobile
Exactly.
phone. And now what we're seeing is that a lot of countries in that region are starting to adopt legislation which allows them to create an M wallet and gradually transform that M wallet associated with their SIM
Hmm.
into what can in the end become an internationally recognizable bank account with an IBAN code and so on. So with layering different levels of verification, you'll be asked to go in person maybe. If you haven't done your SIM registration in person when you bought it, you'll be asked to provide some documentation, some tax codes, so tax numbers or citizens reference numbers or anything like that that might be issued to you by the government. But the whole idea is they've gone past the necessity to have banks issue people with bank accounts because
Mm.
they had the telco industry penetrate that market first, and that created
Well,
a population baseline.
yeah, but basically what they're doing is the way I see it is they're pushing registration onto different vendors. As simple as that. Before you had to go and turn up at a bank with your document. Now you're going and purchasing a mobile phone, and the vendor for the SIM card might not have a stringent, a procedure for registration. You might not be required to jump through as many identification hoops at the beginning of the process, and then later on you'll ask to be provided them virtually, or maybe it'll just be based on the fact that you are known to be a well-behaved consumer of the product for a certain period of time.
Yeah, and this is where it's interesting to see how the regulation is changing in the global landscape. We have countries across Africa which are adopting a share and collect strategy where they
Mm,
share the credentials of all of the users that have been issued with a SIM card, and they collect that for their own records and purposes. And there are some
yep.
countries which also do share and validate. So you have to make sure that the person that's buying a SIM is actually a real person and deduplicated within your system. So that
Yeah.
way they're fighting against money laundering with multiple people using burner phones and burner SIMs like that. And they're
Yeah.
fight
Exactly.
yeah, so that's the main reason. And we see this telco registration legislation and regulations take a sweep across a lot of the world. We've seen this happening in the Middle East. We've seen this happening in the Southeast Asia. Parts of southern Italy are going through this again. Africa, like we mentioned, and there are even talks that the U.S. will have some reviews or at least a consultation with regards to what has become SIM swap as a term of
Yeah.
fraud called by the people that have to deal with in the western side of the world.
Mm. But that's it. I mean, it opens up a whole new range of dangers, and for me, it's something that maybe government should be far more involved in how this is being created, rather than relying on somebody else to create the services for them, rather than putting the emphasis on someone else to create the registration process. It should be much more down to governments to create some kind of safe, uh, properly policed digital identity from the outset that could then be accessed by all these different partners. Um, it's nice that we're seeing the regulations coming in sort of some of the more developed countries, but what we're talking about here is the fact that we're almost circumventing all of that, and we're creating regulations after the fact in countries that are moving a lot further forward and a lot further down the stream with this digital registration process and creating a digital identity before you've even really established what the potential fallbacks are with this, where the potential pitfalls, I should say.
Yeah, and we've seen that this regulation catch up to technology um, a long time, like for a long time now. This is not something new. We have Moore's law that the technology will be growing exponentially up until a certain point when it becomes like chemically impossible. But up until then, we will be carrying on and growing the rate of information that we're gathering, the rate of information that we're processing, and the overall question is what's there in place to make sure that we don't misuse this technology and we have ethical rules when we come
Mm.
to looking at people and profiling them, because in the end you need a form of thresholds. You need risk-driven decisions. So those driving risks are in the form of thresholds, of limits of how much risk you're willing to take. So those thresholds, when you're setting them, it's very important to make sure that you're not discriminating against anyone, as Simon
Yeah.
mentioned. You're not leaving anyone behind,
Yeah.
and you're enabling the people that have already been marginalized once not to have to deal
Not
with
to
that yet again.
exactly continue to be marginalised as a society, and the industry moves onwards. But this to me is the fundamental problem is if you're allowing private industry or private firms to create this environment in the first place. If you don't have government that is aware of what's happening and is participating in it from the outset, but rather just letting private companies or private firms get on with it, create it all, and then jumping in afterwards, it sets you up to fail in the first place, because then you have the biases built in, or you're relying on someone that's trying to make profit from something to do what's ethically right, instead of having that what should be a more ethical outlook from the beginning, and less driven by peaks and troughs.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense, and especially in the global context where we are right now,
Mm,
this is something that most people want to keep an eye out for. And even when governments go ahead and devote a lot of energy and effort into creating a form of citizen registration for users and companies, like we have the gov.verify project in the UK,
yeah,
even with the best intentions, it can sometimes um, fail on the delivery and be less usable than it was originally anticipated. So making sure that
of
you
course.
do capture all of your users is very important, and all of your users' needs more especially.
Yeah, of course. But I think maybe the point is there. If you're learning from your mistakes, then maybe the point is, rather than either of the two camps that we're seeing here, where governments are getting involved but maybe aren't fully aware of the landscape, or you're letting private industry completely lead the way, unfettered, and then you play catch up to them afterwards. Maybe there's more of a consultation that could be taking place, and much more of a partnership between the two, as opposed to one or the other dominating. And then that way, you're more likely to get something that's going to fit both parties' needs. You're going to end up with something, hopefully, that bears in mind the rights of the individuals and all individuals, so it's inclusive, and at the same time is built in such a way that it is viable, it does work, and it doesn't miss the mark as badly as we've seen some of these failed attempts fall flat of the mark.
Yeah, and it's important to consider also the fraud deterrence aspect of any of these solutions, where like it's all
Of course.
great and awesome to have a solution which is open and enables everyone to use that service, but at the same time,
Mm,
you don't want to have a sieve that's too wide. You want to
mm.
stop some of the bad actors from the get go,
Oh,
and
very much so, yeah.
this is a concept which um, is being touched upon on the most recent FATF guidelines for digital identity. They
Mm.
acknowledge the concept of mass repeat attacks, where you
Yes.
have a group of organized criminals which identify a vulnerability in any given system and then
And
proceed
then,
to exploit it.
yeah,
So
ad nauseum, yeah.
yeah, exactly. And the only guideline or the only solution or mitigation strategy you can have against this is to have a risk based layered approach with multiple elements in there. So you
Mm.
would look at um, all of the information that's available to you, such as GPS data, together with, for example, information both biometric, both in terms of, let's say, a fingerprint or a face, which would be static, as well as dynamic, such as, let's say, like mechanical keystrokes or the typing speed. So make sure that you would use all of the potential signals that you would have from any interaction with the user to capture all of or enough information to make sure that that is a genuine transaction and not a fraudster. Because this is something we've seen as well. When fraudsters tend to operate, they're very mindful of their time and effort spent. So they will come up with what we in the industry call passable fraud, the least amount of effort that gets them the most amount of access.
Oh, totally, yeah.
Yeah, and that's where we need to pay a lot of attention. All of these systems need to be dynamic when it comes to validating and proving identity, and they need to be able to consume, let's say, for example, watch lists from the Interpol that get updated about known criminals and things like that.
Which are obviously in turn updated by the individual countries reporting. So again, it comes down to decent recording and reporting of any of these elements. But yes, certainly, I think including databases like that would make a massive difference. But it's easier said than done, and there's quite a few hurdles that have to be leapt over before you can. Before private firms or anyone else like that could rightly access that kind of material. You need to kind of it's that difficult kind of balance between as we've been saying all along, but even in this case of having something that's accessible to help prevent fraud, but at the same time not making it so accessible that it actually assists fraud.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. It's friendly friction. It's finding the balance that a good user is willing to cope with, but a fraudster would ignore in favor of a more profitable opportunity.
Yeah,
that's essentially what's going on. And then on that note, with fraudsters trying to make advantage of the most profitable, let's say, enterprises these days, we all know, or at least we've seen some of the interesting buying trends across the world now that people are actually, the WHO has declared coronavirus a pandemic. So there are a few services right now, medical services and so on, that offer masks. Everyone traveling anywhere would want to get a mask. Anyone going in through a public space would like to get a mask to cover their mouth and nose, so that they make sure they have a smaller chance of contacting a pathogen or a virus.
Yeah, I think there's loads of different grades, aren't there? There's some that are supposed to that apparently will only stop you contaminating other people, because they will trap what as you're coughing or breathing out germs or whatever, it will trap that, but not necessarily stop you from contracting a pathogen yourself. But that's one example. I think there's many different levels, and they come with different classifications, medical classifications on them as to how much protection they're supposed to give you. But therein lies the way that some people are really taking advantage of the current situation.
Yeah, so what's happening is all kinds of masks are being marketing as the wrong category of medical grade. So people that are buying masks which are supposedly for clinical use and would protect against bioaerosols, these types of masks actually end up being nothing more than just simple paper cups or something
Exactly.
that looks close enough, or it doesn't even have to be made from the appropriate material. It just has to look and feel close enough that someone would consider this to be a genuine product. And
Exactly.
people will see one and then they'll buy 20 because of the hysteria that they'll have. So therein lies the second piece of fraud. You show one box of fake masks, but then you ship 19 of them that are empty.
The old switcheroo. But yeah, but that leads us on to, again, the other item that I've seen as well, fake hand sanitizers or fake disinfectant. I mean, hand sanitizer is the big one at the moment. That's selling out everywhere, I think, along with toilet roll, apparently. But no one's trying to sell fake toilet roll. But fake hand sanitizers, definitely something that's cropping up at the moment. And yes, I think that the sad part about this is people are resorting to all kinds of shoddy products. I mean, fake pharmaceuticals is nothing new. This, there's been counterfeit pharmaceuticals going back for decades. It's not a new thing. There's money to be made. Certainly on the internet, it's a real problem, and it's a problem that the pharmaceutical industry is very keen to stay on top of, or try and police as much as possible. But hand sanitizers, when it's in as much demand as it is at the moment, was always bound to be something where someone was going to exploit that need.
Yeah, and this kind of impulse buying and pressure buying is something that will definitely trick the fraudsters, or at least give the fraudsters an opportunity to hijack that fear and that motivation that you have to essentially protect yourself. And they'll hijack that value of yours and that goal of yours to their advantage. And that's something that you should always be conscious of and mindful of. So we've as we've heard today, this is it's always an interesting challenge to maintain the balance between openness and allowing transparency and usability to everyone that should legally and rightfully access the service, and with the bad actors and all of the people that would aim to defraud and make gain for themselves and cause damages to other people. And that's where regulations come in. And what regulations do is they set the frameworks for how you put those checks and balances in, and what are the technologies and the approaches which are the most palatable or most in line with what the end citizens or users expect.
They should be there to protect the individual, and, as you say, lay out a framework by which the rules by which everyone's going to play, and make sure that the game is fair. I think essentially.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Like making sure that everyone's playing by the same rules, and the rules are all transparent and open, and everyone has the same potential to succeed as anyone else.
Yeah.
Right. So, on that note, thank you very much for listening to today's podcast. Simon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimi. A pleasure as always.
If you're interested in learning more about fraud or what we're doing to combat fraud, head over to our website, onfido.com. You can also follow Onfido on LinkedIn, Twitter, and the other social media. And as always, thank you very much for tuning in and listening to us rant about fraud and identity.
We hope to speak to you again next time. Take care for now.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.